Margaret Chen stood in her small kitchen, staring at the thick brown envelope on the counter. The morning sunlight streamed through her old curtains, casting shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Inside that envelope was $50,000 in cash, more money than she had ever held in her hands at one time. She picked up her coffee cup with shaking fingers and took a sip. The coffee had gone cold, but she barely noticed. Her mind kept drifting back to 3 weeks ago, when she had signed the final papers for her mother's house. The small 2-bedroom home where she had grown up, where her mother had lived for 43 years, was now sold to a young family with 2 children. Margaret's mother had passed away 6 months earlier after a long battle with cancer. The house had been sitting empty since then, filled with memories and furniture that Margaret couldn't bear to sort through. When her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, mentioned that her nephew was looking for a house in the area, Margaret knew it was time to let go. The sale had gone smoothly. The buyer paid in cash, wanting to close quickly. Margaret's real estate agent had warned her about accepting such a large cash payment, but everything checked out. The money was legitimate, the paperwork was proper, and yesterday the buyer had handed over $50,000 in neat stacks of $100 bills. Now Margaret sat in her kitchen, dressed in her usual clothes, a soft blue cardigan her mother had knitted for her last Christmas, faded jeans with a small hole near the knee, and her comfortable white sneakers that she wore everywhere. She looked exactly like what she was, a 45-year-old librarian who lived quietly, saved carefully, and never asked for much from life. Margaret worked part-time at the Riverside Public Library, helping people find books and teaching computer skills to senior citizens. She loved her job, even though the pay wasn't much. Her husband David had always told her to pursue what made her happy, and books had always made her happy. When she was younger, she had dreamed of becoming a teacher, but life had taken different turns. Still, at the library, she felt like she was making a difference in small ways. Her old Honda Civic sat in the driveway, the same car she had been driving for 8 years. David was always offering to buy her something newer, but Margaret liked her car. It was reliable, good on gas, and it got her where she needed to go. She had never been the type of person who needed fancy things to feel good about herself. The house she shared with David was modest, a 3-bedroom ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood, where kids rode their bikes in the street and neighbors still waved to each other. They had been living there for 12 years, and Margaret had made it into a warm, comfortable home filled with books, plants, and photographs of family. Margaret finished her coffee and looked at the clock on the microwave. It was almost 10 in the morning. She had called the bank yesterday to ask about depositing a large amount of cash, and the woman on the phone had told her to come in during regular business hours with proper identification and paperwork about where the money came from. Margaret had gathered all the documents, the sales contract, the deed transfer, and a letter from her real estate agent explaining the transaction. She picked up the envelope and felt its weight. This money would help her and David in so many ways. They had been talking about taking a vacation, something they hadn't done in years. David worked so hard, often late into the night, and Margaret thought he deserved to relax somewhere beautiful. Maybe they could finally visit Ireland, where her grandmother had been born. Or perhaps they could take that photography trip to national parks that David had mentioned wanting to do. Margaret also wanted to donate some of the money to the library where she worked. The children's section needed new books, and the computers in the public access area were getting old. She had watched people struggle with the slow machines, and she knew that better equipment would help so many families who couldn't afford computers at home. Walking to her bedroom, Margaret looked at herself in the full-length mirror that David had hung on the closet door. Her brown hair was starting to show gray streaks, something she had been noticing more since her mother's death. She looked tired, but then again she had been feeling tired a lot lately. Grief was exhausting in ways she hadn't expected. She grabbed her purse, a simple black bag she had owned for years, and made sure she had everything she needed. Driver's license, bank account information, all the paperwork about the house sale, and the envelope of cash. Margaret had never been inside the downtown branch of First National Bank before. She usually did her banking at the small branch near the grocery store, but they had told her that for large cash deposits, she needed to go to the main location. Margaret had looked up the bank online and seen pictures of the impressive building with its marble columns and crystal chandeliers. It looked like the kind of place where important business happened, where wealthy people managed their money. She felt a little nervous about going there, but she reminded herself that she was a customer too, and she had every right to be there. Before leaving the house, Margaret called David to let him know where she was going. He was in a meeting, so she left a voicemail. "Hi, honey, I'm heading to the bank downtown to deposit the money from Mom's house. Should be back home in a couple hours. Love you." The drive downtown took about 20 minutes. Margaret found a parking spot 2 blocks away from the bank and walked slowly, taking in the busy city atmosphere. People in business suits hurried past her, talking on phones and checking their watches. Everyone seemed to move with such purpose and urgency. Margaret felt out of place in her simple clothes, but she reminded herself that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. As she approached the impressive building that housed First National Bank, Margaret took a deep breath. The tall glass doors reflected her image back at her, an ordinary woman carrying a large envelope, about to make the biggest deposit of her life. She had no idea that this simple banking transaction would change everything, not just for her, but for everyone inside that building. Margaret pulled open the heavy door and stepped into the cool marble lobby, ready to complete what she thought would be a routine task. Margaret's footsteps echoed softly on the polished marble floor as she entered the bank. The ceiling stretched high above her, decorated with intricate moldings that reminded her of old government buildings. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the space, and she could hear the quiet hum of air conditioning mixed with hushed conversations. The bank was busier than she had expected. Well-dressed people stood in short lines at the teller windows, while others sat in leather chairs near the offices along the far wall. Margaret noticed how everyone seemed to belong here. The women in their tailored suits and expensive handbags, the men in crisp shirts checking their phones. She looked down at her simple cardigan and felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Margaret walked toward the information desk, where a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair was helping another customer. When it was her turn, Margaret stepped forward with a polite smile. "Good morning," Margaret said quietly. "I need to make a large cash deposit. I have all the paperwork with me." The woman, whose name tag read Ashley, looked Margaret up and down with a quick glance that seemed to take in everything. Her worn jeans, her old sneakers, the envelope she clutched in her hands. Ashley's smile became noticeably cooler. "How large of a deposit?" Ashley asked, her tone already skeptical. $50,000, Margaret replied, speaking softly so other customers wouldn't overhear. Ashley's eyebrows rose slightly. She looked at Margaret again, this time more obviously, as if trying to figure out if this ordinary-looking woman could possibly have that kind of money. "You'll need to go to window 3, Ashley said, pointing toward the far end of the teller area. "That's where we handle unusual transactions." Margaret thanked her and walked toward window 3, not realizing that Ashley had already picked up her phone to alert the teller about the situation heading her way. At window 3, a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun was finishing with another customer. When Margaret approached, the teller looked up with a professional smile that quickly faded when she saw who was standing in front of her. "I'm Jessica," the teller said.
"I understand you want to make a large cash deposit?"
"Yes," Margaret replied, pulling out her identification and the envelope. "I have $50,000 from the sale of my mother's house. I have all the documentation right here." Jessica's eyes widened when Margaret placed the thick envelope on the counter. She stared at it for a long moment before looking back at Margaret with obvious suspicion. "This is a lot of cash," Jessica said slowly. "We're going to need to verify the source of these funds very carefully." Margaret nodded, understanding that banks had procedures to follow. "Of course. I have the real estate contract, the deed, and a letter from my agent explaining everything." But as Margaret spread the papers on the counter, she noticed that Jessica wasn't really looking at them. Instead, the teller kept glancing at Margaret's clothes, her simple purse, her modest appearance. Jessica picked up her phone and spoke quietly into it. Within minutes, a middle-aged man in a gray suit approached the window. His expression was stern, and he looked at Margaret with the same suspicious scrutiny that Jessica had shown. "I'm Mr. Peterson, the supervisor," he said without offering to shake hands. "There seems to be a question about this deposit. Can you step over here, please?" Margaret felt her cheeks begin to burn as Mr. Peterson led her to a small area near the side of the lobby. Other customers were starting to notice the commotion, and she could feel their curious stares. She had never been made to feel like she was doing something wrong when she was simply trying to conduct legitimate business. "Now," Mr. Peterson said, crossing his arms, "I need you to explain exactly where this money came from." Margaret patiently explained about her mother's death, the house sale, and the cash payment from the buyer. She showed him every document she had brought, speaking clearly and honestly. But with each explanation, Mr. Peterson's frown deepened. "This is highly unusual," he said, shaking his head. "People don't just walk around with $50,000 in cash. Are you sure this money isn't from some other source?" "What other source?" Margaret asked, confused by the implication in his tone. "Well," Mr. Peterson said, lowering his voice but not enough that nearby customers couldn't hear, "sometimes people come in with large amounts of cash that they can't properly account for. Money from gambling or under-the-table work or other activities." Margaret felt as if she had been slapped. She stared at Mr. Peterson, hardly believing what she was hearing. "Sir, I've shown you all the legal paperwork. Everything is documented. I'm a librarian, and this money is from my mother's estate." "A librarian," Mr. Peterson repeated, his tone making it clear he didn't believe her. "And you're telling me a librarian has $50,000 in cash?" By now, Jessica had called someone else over, a woman in an expensive-looking business suit who introduced herself as Mrs. Williams, the branch manager. She looked at Margaret with the same cold suspicion that the others had shown. "We're going to need to hold this money pending further investigation," Mrs. Williams announced. "This kind of cash transaction raises red flags, especially when the customer can't adequately explain the source." "But I have explained it," Margaret said, her voice beginning to shake with frustration and embarrassment. "I've shown you every piece of documentation. What more do you need?" "We'll need to verify your story independently," Mrs. Williams replied. "That could take several days, maybe weeks. In the meantime, we can't process this deposit." Margaret looked around and realized that a small crowd had gathered to watch the spectacle. She saw people whispering to each other, probably wondering what this ordinary-looking woman had done wrong. Some seemed to be taking pictures with their phones as if she were some kind of criminal they wanted to document. "Are you suggesting that I stole this money?" Margaret asked quietly, trying to maintain her dignity despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "We're not suggesting anything," Mr. Peterson said loudly enough for others to hear. "We're just following proper procedures for suspicious transactions." Margaret felt tears beginning to sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of all these strangers. She had never been treated this way in her life. She was a law-abiding citizen who paid her taxes, volunteered at community events, and had never even gotten a speeding ticket. Yet here she was being treated like a criminal because she didn't look like their idea of someone who could legitimately have $50,000. "I'd like to speak to someone else," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is unacceptable," Mrs. Williams smiled coldly. "I'm the highest authority at this branch. If you don't like our procedures, you're free to take your business elsewhere." Margaret stood there for a moment, clutching her purse in the envelope full of cash, surrounded by suspicious bank employees and curious onlookers. She had never felt so small, so judged, so completely humiliated, but she wasn't ready to give up. This was her mother's money, legitimately earned and legally sold, and she wasn't going to let these people make her feel ashamed of it. With trembling fingers, Margaret pulled out her phone and sent a simple text message to her husband. "David, I need you at First National Bank downtown. They won't let me deposit Mom's money. Please come." Margaret stood near the side wall of the bank, still clutching her phone after sending the text to David. The envelope full of cash sat on a nearby counter under the watchful eye of Jessica, who acted as if Margaret might suddenly grab it and run. Other customers continued to stare and whisper, some still holding their phones up as if this was some kind of entertainment for their social media feeds. Mrs. Williams had returned to her office but kept glancing through her glass door at Margaret, clearly treating her like a potential threat. Mr. Peterson hovered nearby, checking his watch and looking annoyed that this situation was taking up his time. Margaret tried to ignore the whispers and stares, but each glance from strangers felt like another small cut to her dignity. 20 minutes passed before Margaret saw a familiar figure push through the heavy glass doors. David Chen walked into the bank wearing his usual casual clothes, a plain gray t-shirt, comfortable jeans, and worn sneakers that had seen better days. His black hair was slightly messy from running his hands through it, something he did when he was stressed or thinking hard. To anyone looking at him, David appeared to be just another ordinary person coming to handle routine banking business. Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her as David's eyes found hers across the crowded lobby. He walked toward her with the same calm, steady pace he always had, but she could see the concern in his dark eyes. David had always been her rock, the person who could make any problem seem manageable just by being there. "What's going on?" David asked quietly as he reached Margaret's side. He spoke in the same gentle tone he used when he came home from work and found her having a difficult day. Margaret felt her composure finally crack a little. "They won't let me deposit Mom's money," she whispered, glancing around at the bank employees who were now watching both of them with suspicion. "They think I stole it or something. They're treating me like a criminal, David, in front of all these people." David's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "Show me what happened." Margaret walked him through the entire humiliating experience, from Ashley's dismissive attitude at the information desk to Mrs. Williams's refusal to process the deposit. As she spoke, David listened carefully, occasionally glancing at the bank employees who were now clearly discussing the situation among themselves. "They have all the paperwork," Margaret continued, her voice getting slightly louder with frustration. "The real estate contract, the deed transfer, everything. But they keep acting like I'm lying about where the money came from, just because I don't look like their idea of someone who should have $50,000. David nodded slowly, taking in every detail. He had always been a good listener, but Margaret could see something else in his expression now, a quiet anger that she rarely saw from her usually patient husband. "Excuse me," David said, approaching Jessica at window 3. "I'd like to speak with your manager about my wife's deposit." Jessica looked David up and down with the same dismissive attitude she had shown Margaret. She saw a casually dressed Asian man with calloused hands and slightly worn clothes, certainly not someone she thought deserved immediate attention. "You'll need to wait in line like everyone else," Jessica said without looking up from her computer screen. "We're dealing with a complicated situation right now." "The complicated situation involves my wife," David replied calmly. "I'd appreciate speaking with someone in charge." Mr. Peterson had been watching the exchange and walked over with an expression of barely concealed annoyance. "Sir, we're handling a sensitive matter involving questionable funds. Unless you have business of your own to conduct, I'll have to ask you to wait in the regular customer area." David's expression didn't change, but Margaret noticed his hands clench slightly at his sides. "My wife has legitimate paperwork for a legitimate transaction. I'd like to understand why she's being treated this way." "Your wife," Mr. Peterson said, emphasizing the words as if he doubted they were really married, "is trying to deposit a suspicious amount of cash without adequate documentation. She showed you the real estate contract and deed," David pointed out. "What other documentation do you need for a house sale?" Mrs. Williams emerged from her office, having apparently decided that this situation required her attention again. She looked at David with the same cold scrutiny she had given Margaret, taking in his casual appearance and unimpressed demeanor. "Are you here to cause trouble?" Mrs. Williams asked David directly. "Because we've already explained our policies to your friend here." Margaret saw David's eyes narrow, slightly at the deliberate hesitation before the word friend, as if Mrs. Williams was suggesting they weren't really married. "I'm here to understand why my wife is being discriminated against," David said, his voice still calm but with an edge that Margaret recognized. It was the tone he used in the rare moments when someone had truly crossed a line with him. "Discriminated against?" Mrs. Williams laughed, a sharp sound that carried across the lobby. "Sir, we follow the same procedures for everyone. If someone walks in here with $50,000 in cash and can't adequately prove where it came from, we have to be cautious." She proved where it came from, David replied. "You're choosing not to accept her proof because of how she looks." The conversation was getting louder, drawing even more attention from other customers. Margaret noticed that people were now openly watching the confrontation, some recording with their phones. She felt mortified but also grateful that David was standing up for her in a way she hadn't been able to do for herself. "Sir," Mr. Peterson interjected, stepping closer to David in what seemed like an intimidating gesture. "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. This is a place of business. David didn't step back. Instead, he looked directly at Mr. Peterson with the kind of steady gaze that made it clear he wasn't easily intimidated. I'm speaking at a normal volume. The only reason this seems loud is because you're not used to people questioning your judgment. Mrs. Williams' face flushed red. That's enough. Both of you need to leave now or I'll call security. As if summoned by her words, a uniformed security guard began walking toward their group. He was a large man who clearly expected his presence alone to end whatever conflict was brewing. Margaret felt a surge of panic. The situation was spinning completely out of control. You're going to have us removed for trying to make a legitimate bank deposit? David asked, his tone still maddeningly calm despite the chaos building around them. We're going to have you removed for causing a disturbance, Mrs. Williams shot back. And for harassing our staff with baseless accusations. Margaret watched her husband's face carefully. She knew David well enough to recognize when he was making a decision. There was a slight pause, a moment of perfect stillness before he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. That won't be necessary, David said quietly. But I think I should make a phone call first. Mrs. Williams rolled her eyes. Call whoever you want. It won't change our policies. Margaret had no idea what David was planning, but she trusted him completely. As he scrolled through his contacts, she noticed something she had never seen before. A small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile that suggested someone was about to learn a very important lesson. The entire lobby seemed to hold its breath as David selected a number and lifted the phone to his ear. David held the phone to his ear, and Margaret could hear the faint sound of ringing. The bank lobby had grown surprisingly quiet, as if everyone sensed that something important was about to happen. Mrs. Williams tapped her foot impatiently, clearly thinking this was just another desperate attempt by two ordinary people to get their way. This is David, he said when someone answered. His voice was calm and professional, completely different from the casual tone he usually used. I need you to connect me with the board of directors immediately. Yes, I know it's short notice. Tell them it's urgent. Mrs. Williams let out an exaggerated sigh. Sir, calling your lawyer or your friend or whoever isn't going to change anything. Our policies are our policies. David didn't respond to her. Instead, he waited patiently as his call was transferred. Margaret noticed that he seemed completely relaxed now, as if some weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Hello, Robert, David said into the phone. Yes, I'm fine. Listen, I'm at your downtown branch right now, and we have a situation that needs immediate attention. Margaret heard a male voice on the other end of the line, speaking rapidly, though she couldn't make out the words. David's expression remained neutral as he listened. No, nothing like that, David continued. But I think you need to conference in the rest of the board. My wife tried to make a simple deposit, and your staff has treated her like a criminal for the past hour. In front of a lobby full of people, Mr. Peterson rolled his eyes and turned to the security guard. This is ridiculous. They're just trying to create drama to get their way. But something strange was happening. David was now speaking in a tone that Margaret had heard before, but only during his late-night phone calls when he thought she was asleep. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to, someone whose opinions mattered to important people. I understand that procedures exist for a reason, David was saying into the phone. But when those procedures become discrimination, we have a problem. Your branch manager just threatened to have my wife and me removed for questioning why a house sale with complete documentation is being treated as suspicious activity. Margaret noticed that people around them were starting to pay attention in a different way. Instead of looking at her and David like they were causing trouble, some customers seemed curious about what kind of phone call could make someone speak with such quiet authority. Mrs. Williams was growing more agitated. Sir, I don't care who you're calling. You need to end this conversation and leave our bank immediately. David held up one finger in a polite gesture asking her to wait. Yes, that's right, he said into the phone. Mrs. Williams is the branch manager, and there's a supervisor named Mr. Peterson and a teller named Jessica. At the mention of her name, Mrs. Williams' expression changed slightly. For the first time, she looked a little uncertain. David listened to whoever was on the other end of the line, nodding occasionally. Yes, I'll hold while you conference them in. He pulled the phone away from his ear and looked at Mrs. Williams with that same small smile Margaret had noticed earlier. They're getting the board of directors on the line. It should just be a minute. The board of directors of what? Mrs. Williams asked, and Margaret could hear the first note of worry in her voice. Of this bank, David replied simply. Mr. Peterson laughed, but it sounded forced. Sir, you can't just call the board of directors. That's not how banks work. Actually, David said, it's exactly how banks work when you're one of their largest account holders. The lobby was now completely quiet, except for the soft background music playing from hidden speakers. Even the tellers at the other windows had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation. David's phone buzzed, and he lifted it back to his ear. Yes, I'm here. Is everyone connected? He paused, listening. Perfect. Now I want to explain what just happened at your downtown branch. Mrs. Williams looked like she wanted to grab the phone away from David, but something held her back. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or the fact that he seemed completely unworried about whatever consequences his actions might bring. My wife, Margaret Chen, came in to deposit $50,000 in cash from her mother's estate sale. David continued speaking into the phone. She brought proper documentation, real estate contract, deed transfer, letter from the agent. But because she doesn't fit someone's idea of what a person with money should look like, she's been humiliated, questioned, and treated like a criminal. Margaret could hear multiple voices on the other end of the line now, all speaking at once. David listened patiently before continuing. Mrs. Williams, the branch manager, told my wife that her documented house sale raised red flags. She implied the money might be from illegal sources. When I tried to intervene, they threatened to have security remove us both. The voices on the phone got louder and more agitated. Margaret caught fragments of the conversation. Someone asking for clarification, someone else sounding very angry, and what sounded like multiple people talking over each other. Mrs. Williams was now staring at David with a mixture of confusion and growing dread. She pulled out her own phone and started typing frantically, probably trying to look up information about who this man could possibly be. Yes, that's correct, David said into his phone. The same accounts we discussed in last month's board meeting. The technology partnership deposit, the development fund, and my personal banking relationship. Jessica, the teller, had gone completely pale. She was whispering urgently to another employee, both of them now looking at David with wide eyes. I understand, David continued, but I want to be clear. This isn't about the money or the accounts. This is about how your staff treats people based on their appearance. My wife is a librarian who dresses modestly and drives an old car. That doesn't make her less worthy of respect or basic dignity. Mrs. Williams's phone began ringing. She looked at the caller ID and her face went completely white. With shaking hands, she answered. Hello? She said, her voice much smaller than it had been moments before. Margaret watched as all the color drained from the woman's face. Yes, he's here. What do you mean, who is he? David was still talking into his own phone. I think the best solution is for me to speak with your branch manager directly. She's right here, and I believe someone is calling her now. Mrs. Williams looked at her phone, then at David, then back at her phone. You're David Chen? She whispered. David smiled politely and nodded. I've been trying to introduce myself properly, but your staff seemed more interested in treating my wife badly than in listening to customers. The woman's hands were visibly shaking now. Margaret could hear someone on Mrs. Williams's phone speaking very loudly and very rapidly, though she still couldn't make out the specific words. All around the lobby, people were starting to realize that something dramatic was happening. The atmosphere had completely shifted from curious entertainment to stunned silence. Even the security guard looked confused about whether he should still be preparing to escort anyone out. David ended his call and looked calmly at Mrs. Williams, who was still frozen with her phone pressed to her ear. I think, David said quietly, we should probably start this conversation over from the beginning. Mrs. Williams stared at David with her phone still pressed to her ear. The voice on the other end was getting louder, and everyone in the nearby area could hear fragments of what sounded like a very upset executive shouting questions and demands. Yes, sir, Mrs. Williams whispered into her phone. Yes, he's standing right here. No, sir, I didn't know. We were just following standard procedures for large cash deposits. The voice on her phone got even louder, and Mrs. Williams held the device away from her ear slightly. Margaret could now clearly hear someone saying $800 million and biggest private client, and what were you thinking? Jessica, the teller, had been doing her own frantic internet search on her computer. She suddenly gasped and turned her screen toward Mr. Peterson, who looked at it and went completely pale. Within seconds, word was spreading among the bank staff in hushed whispers and shocked expressions. David stood calmly in the center of it all, watching as the realization spread through the group of people who had spent the last hour treating him and Margaret like potential criminals. He didn't look angry or victorious. If anything, he looked sad. "Mrs. Williams," David said gently, "perhaps you should put your call on speaker so everyone can hear what your board of directors is saying." Mrs. Williams looked terrified, but she pressed the speaker button with a trembling finger. Immediately, a man's voice filled the area around them, clear and unmistakably furious. "Mrs. Williams, do you have any idea what you've done? David Chen is not just any customer. His company deposited $500 million with us last month. His personal accounts hold over $800 million. He's the reason we're opening 3 new branches this year." The entire lobby fell silent except for the voice coming from the phone. Margaret noticed that several customers had their phones out, recording everything. She realized this was probably going to be all over social media within hours. The voice continued. "Mr. Chen's technology partnership has brought in more business than any client in the bank's history. And you treated his wife like a criminal for trying to deposit money from her mother's estate?" Mrs. Williams tried to speak, but no words came out. She looked around desperately, as if hoping someone else would step in and fix the situation she'd created. David reached over and gently took Mrs. Williams's phone. "This is David," he said calmly. "I think we can handle this from here, but I'll need to speak with you and the board about implementing some changes." "Mr. Chen," the voice on the phone said, "I cannot apologize enough. We will make this right immediately. Whatever you need, whatever your wife needs, we will take care of it right now." "I appreciate that," David replied, "but I think the first thing we need to do is address how your staff treats customers who don't look wealthy enough to deserve basic respect." David ended the call and handed the phone back to Mrs. Williams, who was now visibly shaking. The lobby remained completely quiet, with dozens of people watching and listening to every word. "My wife," David said, speaking clearly so everyone could hear, "came here this morning to do something simple: deposit money from her mother's house. Her mother passed away 6 months ago, and selling that house was emotional enough without being treated like she was lying about it." Margaret felt tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of humiliation anymore. They were tears of gratitude for having someone who would stand up for her this way. David continued. "Margaret is a librarian. She volunteers at community events. She's never even gotten a speeding ticket. But because she dresses modestly and drives an old car, your staff decided she must be lying about having legitimate money." Mr. Peterson tried to speak up. "Sir, we were just following procedures." David held up a hand to stop him. "No, you weren't following procedures. You were making assumptions based on appearance. Margaret brought proper documentation for everything. You chose not to accept it because she didn't look the way you think wealthy people should look." Jessica, the teller, was now crying quietly at her window. The security guard had backed away completely, looking like he wished he could disappear. David's voice remained calm, but Margaret could hear the deep disappointment in it. "The money you refuse to accept represents the sale of a home where my wife grew up, where her mother lived for over 40 years, where Margaret learned to read, did her homework, celebrated birthdays and Christmas mornings. That house meant everything to her family." Several people in the lobby were nodding, and Margaret noticed that some of the customers who had been staring and whispering earlier now looked ashamed of their own behavior. "But more than that," David continued, "the way you treated Margaret tells me something about how you treat other customers who don't fit your idea of what wealthy people look like. How many other people have you humiliated this way? How many other customers have you driven away because of your assumptions?" Mrs. Williams finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Mr. Chen, we sincerely apologize. We had no idea who you were." David looked directly at her. "That's exactly the problem. You had no idea who I was, so you felt free to treat my wife badly. But the issue isn't that you should have treated her better because of who I am. The issue is that you should treat everyone with dignity regardless of who they are." The main doors of the bank opened, and a man in an expensive suit hurried in, looking around frantically until he spotted David. This was clearly someone from the bank's upper management who had been called in to handle the crisis. "Mr. Chen," the man said, slightly out of breath, "I'm Robert Hayes, the regional president. I came as soon as I heard what happened." David nodded politely. "Hello, Robert. I think we need to have a serious conversation about customer service training at this branch." Robert looked around at the assembled staff, all of whom were now staring at the floor, or looking anywhere except at David and Margaret. "Absolutely. There will be immediate consequences for this incident." "I'm glad to hear that," David said. "But I want to be clear about something. This isn't about revenge or punishment. This is about making sure it never happens to anyone else." Margaret watched her husband with deep admiration. Even in this moment when he had every right to be angry, he was thinking about other people who might face discrimination. David turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "Everyone here got to see something important today. You saw how quickly people's attitudes change when they realize someone has money or power. But dignity and respect shouldn't depend on wealth. They should be given to everyone." Several people in the crowd nodded and murmured their agreement. Margaret noticed that some of them looked genuinely moved by what they had witnessed. Robert Hayes was speaking quietly with Mrs. Williams, Mr. Peterson, and Jessica. Margaret couldn't hear everything he was saying, but she caught words like suspended and immediate review and sensitivity training. David walked over to the counter where Margaret's envelope still sat and picked it up. "I think we'll be taking our business to a different bank," he said to Robert. "But I hope the changes you make here will help other customers in the future." As David and Margaret walked toward the exit, the lobby remained unusually quiet. People stepped aside to let them pass, and Margaret heard someone say, "That was incredible." Outside on the sidewalk, Margaret finally let herself cry, not from humiliation this time, but from relief and love for the man who had just shown an entire room of people what standing up for someone really looked like. David put his arm around her shoulders. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's go find a bank that knows how to treat people right."